The German Shepherd stood frozen at the cellar entrance, trembling and growling. Bolt was terrified, not of the dark, but of what was inside it. Driven by the truth, the veteran Jack descended. In the farthest corner, he found a strange pile of stacked stones. He used his crowbar to move them. Behind the rocks was a secret nook, and inside that nook, an oilcloth package held the tin box and the journal, the answer to a 50-year-old tragedy. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The sound of the engine, a low rumble that had been Jack's only companion for 3 days, finally ceased. He turned the key, and the silence that rushed in to fill the vacuum was immediate and absolute. It was bigger than any quiet he had ever known. It was the high plains silence of Wyoming, vast, profound, and utterly indifferent. Jack Callahan sat for a long moment, his hands calloused and scarred, resting on the steering wheel of his old pickup. He was a man in his early 40s, though the harsh, unfiltered sunlight made him look older, highlighting the deep lines etched around his eyes and the silver gray that heavily streaked the brown hair at his temples. He was tall and lean, retaining the hard, economical strength of his life as an Army Ranger. His face was rugged, weathered by stress and sun, and covered in a thick stubble that was more salt than pepper. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. A low, anxious whine came from the passenger seat. Jack turned, the tension in his shoulders easing fractionally. "Easy, boy. We're here." Bolt, his 5-year-old German Shepherd, pushed a heavy head against Jack's shoulder. Bolt was a striking animal, not the typical black and tan, but a dominant gray and white, his thick silver coat almost wolf-like. His eyes were the color of dark amber, intelligent and intensely intuitive. He shifted his weight, pressing closer to Jack, sensing the change in his man's breathing. "This is it, Bolt," Jack murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "This is the spot." He opened the truck door. The wind hit him immediately, a cold, sharp gust that smelled of pine, dust, and immense distance. It ripped at his flannel shirt, forcing him to squint. The Wind River Ranch, as the listing had called it, was a generous name. The main house was a 2-story wooden structure that looked like it had lost a fight with the last several decades. The paint, once white, was now a peeling, chalky gray. The roof on the west side had a noticeable, worrying sag. Several upstairs windows were dark, gaping holes, the glass long gone. The barn, 50 yards away, leaned a good 10 degrees to the north, looking as though one more strong gust might finally convince it to lie down. The realtor in Cheyenne had thought he was crazy. "It's a fixer-upper, Mr. Callahan," the young man had said nervously. "And by fixer, I mean it needs everything." Jack had just nodded. "It's private?" "Oh, it's private?" the realtor had laughed, relieved. "You won't see another soul out here unless you want to. You're miles from your nearest neighbor, and they're not the visiting type." That had sealed the deal. To Jack, the ranch was perfect. It was isolated. It was raw. And it was broken. It didn't need a coat of paint. It needed structural support. It needed a new roof, new windows, new floors. It needed a war waged against rot and decay. His therapist back east had called it project-based therapy. Jack called it a way to keep his hands busy. He needed physical labor to suppress the psychological turmoil, a tangible fight to distract him from the one he kept losing in his own mind. He needed a place where the only sounds were the wind and his own hammer. Bolt was more than a dog. He was an anchor. In the long, humid nights back east, when the apartment walls seemed to pulse with the city's noise, Bolt had been his guardian. When the memory surfaced, the choking dust of the IED blast, the ringing in his ears, the horrifying final stillness of Sergeant Evans, the man he had failed to save, Bolt would be there. The dog would wake from a deep sleep, sensing the shift in Jack's breathing, and press his solid, warm 80-pound body against Jack's chest. He was a living, breathing tether to the present, a psychological watchman patrolling the dark borders of Jack's mind. They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the bare essentials, A cot, his old army footlocker, a cooler of food, a generator, and a heavy canvas bag filled with dog food. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. It smelled of mildew, old wood, and the faint, dusty remains of mice. Bolt padded cautiously through the empty rooms, his claws making small, sharp clicking sounds on the hardwood floors. He sniffed every corner, his tail low but not tucked, his head high as he catalogued the new territory. He seemed to wait for Jack's cue, his amber eyes flicking back to the man every few seconds. Jack didn't rest. He couldn't. To rest was to think. To think was to remember. He immediately grabbed his heavy toolbox from the truck bed. He would sleep in the main downstairs room. It seemed the most structurally sound. He started on the largest window, the one boarded up with warped plywood. The physical exertion was a relief, a welcome burn in his shoulders and back as he fought with the rusted nails, the wood splintering under the force of the crowbar. He worked until his hands were raw and the sun began to dip behind the Laramie Mountains, painting the vast sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The temperature dropped instantly. As he worked, he tried to ignore the silence. It was different from the clean, windswept silence outside. This silence was inside the house. It was heavy, oppressive, and settled in the corners like thick cobwebs. It was the silence of abandonment, of a place that had been empty for a very, very long time. Jack was used to the noise of the barracks, the noise of the city, even the constant high-frequency ringing in his ears. This quiet was a void, and his mind, haunted by its survivor's guilt, rushed to fill it. He stopped, leaning against the empty window frame, breathing hard. The image flashed in his mind, unbidden. Evans, his hand outstretched, the sound of the blast. Jack squeezed his eyes shut. His breath hitched. A wet nose pushed firmly into his palm. He opened his eyes and looked down. Bolt was there, staring up at him with that unsettling, intuitive gaze. The dog didn't whine or bark. He just stood there, a solid silver-gray presence, and watched. "Just tired, boy," Jack lied, his voice a low rasp. Bolt whined softly, a low puff of air, as if calling him a liar. Jack ran his hand over the dog's broad head, grounding himself. "Right, you're right. Just the cold." Later that evening, he sat on his cot, eating cold stew from a can with a plastic spoon. Bolt lay at his feet, chewing rhythmically on a heavy bone. The only light came from a single, battery-powered lantern, casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. Every creak of the old house settling in the night air was magnified. A loose shutter banged rhythmically against the siding somewhere upstairs, a lonely, repetitive sound. Jack tried to focus on his list for the next day. Priority 1, secure the roof. Priority 2, finish the windows. But the oppressive silence of the house was too big. It was a canvas, and his guilt was eager to paint. He could smell the diesel and the cordite. He could feel the weight of Evans as he pulled him from the wreckage, the blood. Jack's hand clenched, crushing the empty can. He heard the sudden stop of Bolt's chewing. The dog stood up, walked over, and placed his heavy head directly on Jack's knee, not moving, just staring up at him. Jack let out the breath he'd been holding in a long, shaky sigh. He dropped his hand onto the dog's head, the thick fur warm beneath his palm. "Okay, boy," he whispered. "Okay, just the house, just the wind." He looked around the dark, empty room. This was it. This was their fortress. He would fight the decay. He would keep his hands busy. He would build something solid, and maybe, just maybe, the sheer physical exhaustion would be enough to keep the ghosts at bay. "Let's get some sleep," Jack said, rubbing the dog's ears. "We have a lot of work to do." Bolt thumped his tail once on the dusty floor, content now that his man was settled. But as Jack lay back on the cot, pulling a rough wool blanket over himself, he could still feel the watchful, oppressive silence of the Wind River Ranch settling around him like a shroud. The second day began with the sharp, crystalline cold of a Wyoming dawn. Jack woke before the sun, his internal clock still set to a rhythm that didn't care about time zones or retirement. He felt the familiar dull ache in his shoulder, a physical reminder that always seemed sharper in the quiet moments before the world woke up. He lay still on the cot, staring at the gray square of the window. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The smell, old wood, dust, and a faint trace of pine, was alien. Then he felt the familiar solid weight against his legs. Bolt was still fast asleep, his flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "Time to work, boy," Jack murmured, swinging his legs off the cot. Bolt was on his feet in an instant, stretching his powerful frame with a long, groaning yawn. He was immediately energized, his tail wagging, his amber eyes bright. The oppressive silence and strange shadows of the previous night were forgotten, replaced by the promise of a new day and endless territory to explore. While Jack heated water on a small propane stove for instant coffee, Bolt nudged the door, eager to be outside. Jack let him out and watched from the doorway, sipping the scalding liquid. The dog raced across the frosted grass, a gray and white streak against the muted browns of the ranch. He bounded toward the dilapidated barn, sniffing excitedly, already on the hunt for mice or rabbits. Jack felt a small knot of tension unwind in his chest. Seeing Bolt act like a normal, happy dog was a relief. It made the isolation feel less like a trap and more like a choice. "Okay," Jack said to himself, pulling on his heavy work gloves. The roof. He spent the entire morning on the west side of the sagging roof. The work was brutal and dangerous. He'd secured himself with a climbing harness looped around the chimney, but every step on the rotten shingles was a calculated risk. He worked with a grim determination, ripping out the old water-damaged wood, the sound of his hammer echoing across the empty landscape. It was a good sound, a solid, repetitive thud that kept his mind focused. Thud, pull the nail. Scrape, toss the shingle. Thud, secure the beam. The rhythm was a meditation. It kept the memories at bay. Evans stayed quiet. The dust of the convoy stayed settled. Bolt spent the morning below, acting as supervisor. He chased field mice, explored the perimeter, and occasionally barked at a distant hawk, but he always returned to sit at the base of the ladder, looking up as if waiting for Jack to finish. He was perfectly content. Around noon, Jack climbed down, his shoulders burning and his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold. "Break time, boy." Bolt fell into step beside him, tail wagging, expecting a share of Jack's lunch. Jack pushed open the heavy front door and walked through the main room toward the kitchen. He stopped at the threshold. Bolt was no longer beside him. Jack looked back. The dog was standing in the doorway of the main room, about 10 feet away, refusing to enter the kitchen. "Come on, boy, lunch," Jack said, walking to the small counter where he'd left his cooler. Bolt whined. It wasn't his usual "I'm hungry" whine, but a low, vibrating sound, high in his throat. He took one hesitant step onto the kitchen's peeling linoleum, then immediately backed out, as if he'd touched something hot. "What's wrong with you?" Jack asked, frowning. He looked around the kitchen. It was just an empty room. Old cabinets, a rusty sink, and in the center of the floor, a metal ring set into the floorboards, the door to the root cellar. Bolt advanced again, very slowly. He lowered his head, sniffing the air near the floor. As he got closer to the center of the room, his entire demeanor changed. The happy, confident dog from the yard was gone. His tail lowered, and Jack saw the hair along his spine, from his neck to the base of his tail, rise slightly. It wasn't an aggressive display, but a reaction of pure anxiety. He stared fixedly at the cellar door. "Bolt, come," Jack commanded, his voice firm but curious. Bolt whined again, a low-frequency sound that was more a vibration than a noise. He backed away, retreating until he was safely in the main room, but he never took his eyes off the floorboards. He was treating the trapdoor as if it were a threat. Jack's curiosity was piqued. He walked over and knelt beside the metal ring. He put his nose close to the crack between the boards. The smell hit him instantly. It was awful. It was the smell of a million years of damp earth, of profound wet rot. A wave of heavy, cold mold and mildew filled his nostrils. It was the concentrated odor of decay. Jack stood up, wiping his hand on his jeans. Phew, okay, I get it. He looked back at Bolt, who was still watching him from the doorway, tense and low to the ground. That's all it is, boy, Jack said, trying to keep his voice light. Just mold, a bad smell. But Bolt didn't relax. Jack walked to the cooler, pulled out a piece of jerky, and tossed it onto the kitchen floor, well away from the door. Bolt looked at the jerky. He looked at Jack. He looked at the trapdoor. He would not move. Jack sighed. Fine, suit yourself. He grabbed his sandwich and a bottle of water and went back outside, sitting on the porch steps. Bolt immediately relaxed, trotting over to sit at his feet, accepting the piece of jerky Jack offered him. You're a sensitive nose, aren't you? Jack muttered, rubbing the dog's head. He dismissed the incident. A dog's sense of smell was a powerful, delicate thing. A cellar that had been sealed for who knows how long, full of rot. Of course it was offensive. He finished his lunch and went back to the roof. The hammering started again, drowning out the silence, and the incident was forgotten. It happened again that evening. Jack was done for the day, cleaning his tools in the fading light of the main room. It was getting colder, and he decided to make his dinner in the kitchen, perhaps the most sheltered room in the house. He walked into the kitchen, and Bolt immediately planted himself in the doorway, refusing to follow. Not this again, Jack said, exasperated. He walked over to the dog. Bolt, look, it's just a floor. He put his hand on Bolt's collar to lead him inside. The dog planted his feet, his muscles tensed. He allowed Jack to pull him a few feet onto the linoleum, but his entire body was shaking, and the low, anxious whine started deep in his chest. He was staring at the trapdoor, his eyes wide, the whites showing. This wasn't just disgust. This was fear. Jack let go instantly. Okay, easy, easy. Bolt scrambled backward, almost tripping over his own feet to get out of the room. He stood in the hallway, breathing heavily, but still watching. Jack stood alone in the kitchen, the silence of the house suddenly returning, heavier than before. He looked at the metal ring in the floor. There's something down there, isn't there, boy? He whispered. He was a practical man. His assumption was simple. Probably a raccoon, he said out loud, more to himself than the dog. Or a skunk. Something crawled under there and died. That had to be it. A dead animal, combined with the heavy mold. It was a logical, simple explanation for the dog's behavior. It explained the intensity of the smell and the dog's unwillingness to be near it. But as he stood there, watching his dog, his fearless, loyal partner, who had been through crowded airports and noisy city streets without flinching, shiver in the doorway, Jack felt a different kind of chill. Bolt wasn't just offended by a smell. He was acting like a watchman on patrol who had just found a tripwire. He was treating the cellar door as a danger. Jack looked at the rusted metal ring. He had too much work to do. The roof was the priority. The windows were the priority. A dead raccoon in a cellar was not. We'll deal with it later, he said, turning his back on the door. It's just a smell. He made his dinner in the main room, the kitchen remaining dark. And all night, Bolt refused to sleep at the foot of the cot. He lay in the doorway, his head on his paws, facing the kitchen, watching the darkness as if he expected it to move. For 3 days, Jack worked. He wrestled with the sagging roof, nailing down heavy tar paper that the wind tried to rip from his hands. He tore out the rotten frames of the upstairs windows, the sharp sound of splintering wood, a satisfying, violent punctuation in the oppressive quiet. And for 3 days, Bolt was his shadow. The gray and white shepherd was perfectly happy so long as they were outside. He chased rabbits, explored the perimeter of the leaning barn, and napped in patches of thin autumn sun. But the kitchen remained a border he would not cross. Every time Jack went inside for water or supplies, Bolt would stop dead at the threshold, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the center of the floor. He refused to eat in the house, so Jack moved his food and water bowls to the covered porch. At night, Bolt no longer slept in the main room, instead choosing to lie in the open front doorway, a vigilant sentinel watching the dark hallway that led to the kitchen. Jack's practical explanation, a dead animal, was starting to feel thin. The dog's fear was too specific, too persistent. It was like a silent, one-animal protest. On the fourth morning, Jack's supplies ran low. He was out of roofing nails, tar, and 2 4s. His food supply was down to jerky and the last of his coffee. "All right, boy," Jack said, rubbing the dog's head. Bolt was ecstatic, recognizing the familiar routine of a car ride. "We need supplies. Let's go to town. You'll be happy to get away from this place for a few hours." Bolt let out a short, happy bark and raced to the truck, leaping into the passenger seat before Jack had even unlocked it. The drive was a study in isolation. The ranch's dirt track met a gravel county road, which eventually spilled onto a 2-lane state highway. For 30 miles, they saw nothing but rolling brown hills, patches of stubborn sagebrush, and the endless, aching blue of the Wyoming sky. The wind rocked the truck, a constant, invisible force. Finally, they crested a low hill and saw the town. It was called Laramie Creek, though the creek was just a dry, rocky bed nearby. The town was one main street, lined with brick-fronted buildings from the early 1900s, their facades weathered by a century of relentless wind. A grain silo stood at one end, a small church at the other. Pickup trucks were parked diagonally in front of the half-dozen active businesses. Jack parked in front of a wide building with a faded sign that read, "Galloway's Mercantile, General Goods, and Diner." A small bell jingled as he pushed the door open. Bolt, on his best behavior, stayed right at Jack's heel. The inside smelled of roasted coffee, bacon, sawdust, and old leather. To the left, a long wooden counter with 4 vinyl stools hosted 3 old-timers in flannel shirts and seed caps nursing coffee. To the right were shelves stacked high with everything from hardware and horse feed to canned goods and ammunition. A man behind the cash register looked up. He was in his late 60s, with a thick gray mustache and a weary expression, wearing a red flannel vest over a denim shirt. He gave Jack a curt nod. "Mornin'," the man said. His voice was gravel. "Morning," Jack replied. He grabbed a small cart and began moving through the aisles, grabbing nails, a gallon of wood glue, coffee, and canned stew. Bolt followed obediently, his presence large, but his manner perfectly calm. Jack brought his items to the counter. The man began ringing them up, his movements efficient. "New in the county?" he asked, not looking up. It was the obligatory small talk. "Just moved in," Jack said. "Passing through or sticking around?" "Sticking around. Bought a place out on Wind River Road." The man's hand, which was reaching for a paper bag, stopped. He froze, just for a second, but it was enough. He slowly looked up at Jack. His eyes, which had been bored, were suddenly sharp and assessing. "Which place?" he asked. The diner side of the store had gone quiet. Jack could feel the eyes of the 3 men at the counter on his back. Even the sound of the grill in the back seemed to have stopped. "The old Croft place," Jack said. The man's face hardened. He didn't say another word. He just looked down, finished bagging the items, and punched the total into the register. The politeness, thin as it was gone. It was replaced by a cold, flat hostility. Jack paid in cash. The man handed him his change without their fingers touching. There was no "thank you," no "have a nice day," no "come back soon." Jack turned, guiding Bolt by the collar. The 3 men at the counter pointedly looked down into their coffee cups or turned their gaze to the street outside. Jack pushed the door open, the bell's cheerful jingle sounding absurd in the sudden, thick silence. He loaded the supplies into the truck bed, his jaw tight. He was used to being an outsider. He'd spent his life being the new guy, the soldier, the man apart. But this was different. This wasn't just suspicion of a newcomer. It was specific. It was aimed at the house. He looked across the street. A small, tidy brick building bore a sign, Laramie Creek County Library. His original plan had been to research the property, to look up old deeds or building permits. Now it felt urgent. He left Bolt in the truck with the windows cracked. The dog was happy to nap, and crossed the street. The library was warm and smelled of floor wax and old dry paper. It was empty save for a woman sitting behind a large wooden desk. She was in her late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, magnified by thick glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. Her white hair was pulled into a neat, severe bun. She looked like the town's memory keeper. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong. "I hope so," Jack said, approaching the desk. "My name is Jack Callahan. I'm looking for information on a property I just bought." "Which property?" she asked, her fingers pausing on her keyboard. "The old Croft place, out on Wind River Road." The librarian, whose nameplate read Evelyn Dean, had the same reaction as the store owner, but with a different flavor. Not hostility, but a deep, profound sadness. She sighed, a long, weary sound, and took off her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Oh dear," she said softly. "You bought that place. They're still selling that place." "So I gather it has a reputation," Jack said, his voice flat. "I got the welcome wagon over at the Mercantile." Evelyn looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. She saw the lines on his face, the military bearing he couldn't hide, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. She made a decision. "The men at the store—" "They mean no harm," she said, lowering her voice, though they were alone. "This is a small town, Mr. Callahan. We have long memories. And that house is the center of our worst memory." She stood and gestured for him to follow, leading him to a small table in the back corner where the local history archives were kept. "You won't find what you need in the deeds," she said. "You need the newspapers." She pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume and opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle. She turned to a section from the spring of 1973. "The Crofts were good people," Evelyn began. "Mark and Amelia. He worked in logging, a good, steady man. She was bright, full of life. They just had their first child, a little girl named Rose." She paused, her finger tracing the edge of a column. "Mark died in an accident. A logging truck overturned in the mountains. It was a terrible thing. It broke this town, and it shattered Amelia." Jack listened, his stomach tightening. "People tried to help," Evelyn continued. "My mother would take them casseroles. But Amelia, she just faded. She wouldn't see anyone. She stayed out there, all alone with the baby, miles from anyone. People started to worry. They said she wasn't right in the head. Grieving." She finally found the page she was looking for and turned the book toward Jack. The headline was stark, black, and terrible. "Local woman and infant daughter missing." The date was April 19th, 1973. "They just disappeared?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Vanished," Evelyn said, her voice heavy with the old mystery. "One day, her brother-in-law, Thomas, drove out to check on them after a bad spring storm. The house was empty, no note, no sign of a struggle, just empty. The car was there, all their clothes, the baby's cradle, everything. They were gone." Jack stared at the grainy photograph of a young, smiling woman holding a bundled infant, Amelia Croft. "The whole county searched for weeks," Evelyn said, her gaze distant. "They searched the hills, the ravines, the old mine shafts. Nothing, not a trace. It was as if the wind just took them." Jack felt a coldness creep up his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. He thought of the heavy, oppressive silence in the house. He thought of the kitchen. And he thought of his dog, standing in the doorway, refusing to enter, staring at the cellar door as if it held a threat. "Thank you, Mrs. Dean," Jack said, his voice thick. He stood up. "Mr. Callahan," she said, stopping him. Her sharp eyes were now filled with a strange pity. "That house has been empty for 50 years for a reason. No one stays. It's a place with a deep, sad memory. Be careful." Jack nodded, unable to speak. The drive back to the ranch was different. The rolling hills no longer looked peaceful. They looked vast and empty, capable of swallowing secrets whole. The wind no longer sounded clean. It sounded like a mournful cry. He pulled up to the house just as the sun was setting. The structure looked dark, its empty windows like vacant eyes. Bolt, who had been asleep in the passenger seat, woke up. He stretched, then looked at the house. He immediately let out a low, anxious whine, his body tensing. He was staring straight at the kitchen window. Jack got out of the truck, the cold wind whipping his hair. He looked at the house, then back at his dog, who refused to get out. The practical explanation was gone. It wasn't a dead raccoon. It wasn't just mold. It was a 50-year-old mystery. And whatever was in that cellar, Bolt knew it. Jack stared at the stark black headline, "Local woman and infant daughter missing." The grainy photograph of the smiling woman, Amelia Croft, seemed to mock the cold text. He looked up from the bound newspaper volume, his gaze meeting Evelyn Dean's. "Vanished," Jack repeated, the word tasting like dust. He was thinking of the cold drafts in the house, the oppressive quiet. "That's the official story, Mr. Callahan," Evelyn said, her strong voice softening. She leaned forward slightly on the archive table. "The one that ran in the papers, the one the sheriff had to file." Jack caught the implication. "The official story?" Evelyn Dean sighed, a long, practiced sound of weary patience. She pushed her thick glasses back up her nose. "This is a small town, as I said. What the men over at the diner believe, what most of this county has believed for 50 years, is something else entirely. Something much darker." She paused as if deciding how much to share with this stranger, this man with the haunted eyes who had just bought the county's biggest ghost. "The story doesn't end with them vanishing," she continued, lowering her voice. "The real story, the one that made this town so cold, started a few days later. It started with Thomas Croft." "The brother-in-law," Jack recalled. "Mark's younger brother." "Yes." Evelyn's expression soured slightly. "Thomas was different from Mark, rougher. He worked ranch jobs here and there, didn't talk much. He was fiercely protective of Amelia after Mark died, but he was erratic, unpredictable." She took a breath. "A few days after that big spring blizzard in 1973, one of the worst we'd had in a decade, it shut down everything, cut the power for days. Thomas drove his truck into town. He seemed panicked. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He went straight to the diner." She gestured with her head toward the street. "He walked in and told old Mr. Galloway, the owner's father, that Amelia couldn't take it anymore. He said she'd packed a bag and that he had personally driven her to Cheyenne to catch a bus back east." Jack frowned, a knot tightening in his gut. "He drove her to Cheyenne? During that storm?" Evelyn nodded, her sharp eyes approving of his quick uptake. "Exactly. That's the crux of it. Old man Galloway was sharp and he knew the roads. He said, 'A bus, Thomas? In this weather? The highway patrol says the roads to Cheyenne are still closed.' Thomas supposedly got furious, defensive, said they'd made it through, and then he stormed out." The silence in the library felt as heavy as the silence in Jack's new home. "The sheriff went out there the next day, of course," Evelyn continued. "Thomas's story just didn't sit right. And what they found, Mr. Callahan, what they found turned this whole county cold." "They found the house empty," Jack said. "Worse, they found it full." Jack waited. Amelia's car, an old Ford sedan, was still in the barn, covered in dust. The sheriff checked the engine. It was cold and hadn't been run in weeks. All her clothes were in the closet. Her winter coat was still on the hook. Her purse was sitting right on the kitchen table. Evelyn leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And the baby's room. It was untouched. The cradle, the blankets, a half-empty box of diapers. Every piece of clothing Rose owned." She held his gaze, the question hanging between them, terrible and unspoken. "You tell me, Mr. Callahan, what mother, grieving or not, catches a bus back east in the middle of a blizzard, leaving her car, her money, and every single thing her infant child owns?" Jack's hands, resting on the table, slowly clenched into fists. He said nothing. Thomas's story didn't just fall apart, Evelyn said, her voice flat. It stank. It was a terrible, clumsy, desperate lie. And when a man lies that badly, it's almost always because the truth is too horrible to tell. This was it. This was the source of the cold shoulders in the diner, the flat hostility from the store owner. So the town decided, Evelyn concluded, straightening up as if to distance herself from the words. Thomas wasn't reporting a disappearance, he was covering one. The belief, the one that has poisoned that property for 50 years, is that Amelia Croft finally snapped. That in her grief and isolation, she did the unthinkable. To the baby, Jack stated. To the baby, Evelyn confirmed, her voice barely audible, and maybe to herself. And the other belief, the one that makes those men at the diner so angry, is that Thomas Croft helped her, that he found them and covered it up. To protect the family name. She hesitated. Or worse. Worse? That he was involved, that Amelia didn't leave at all in any sense, that something happened in that house between him and her. No one knows, but everyone believes something awful happened. And Thomas, he left the county a week later and never came back. A cold, sharp anger surged through Jack. It was so sudden and intense, it almost made him dizzy. It was a familiar feeling, a dark companion he knew well. It wasn't just anger at Thomas or the town, it was a deep, searing rage against the injustice of it all. He knew this story, he'd seen it before. A woman shattered by grief, isolated, and alone. The town whispers. They call her not right in the head. They judge her from the warmth of their diners and their churches. And when the worst happens, when she disappears, they don't assume a tragedy. They assume a crime. They leap to the darkest, most monstrous conclusion possible and call it justice, letting it harden into fact for 5 decades. The injustice of it struck a raw nerve, one that vibrated with the core of his own trauma. He thought of the looks he got, the way people's eyes shifted when they found out he was a veteran, the assumptions they made. They saw the quiet, the isolation, and they filled in the blanks with their own fears. Broken, unstable, dangerous. They told his story for him, never knowing the face of the man he couldn't save, never feeling the weight of the guilt he carried. He felt a sudden, fierce, and utterly irrational protectiveness for the ghost in the grainy photograph. He didn't believe it. He didn't believe a mother who kept that house, who had a nursery, could do what they said. The town saw a clumsy lie and assumed the worst of Amelia. Jack saw a clumsy lie and assumed a terrified man, Thomas, covering up a tragedy he couldn't explain. "They're wrong," Jack said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn looked surprised by the force in his voice. "We don't know that, Mr. Callahan. We just know a lie was told." "They're wrong," Jack repeated, his voice low and hard. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He looked at the librarian. "Thank you, Mrs. Dean. You've been very helpful." He walked out of the library, the bell's jingle sounding hollow. The Wyoming wind hit him, sharp and cold, but his anger burned hotter. He crossed the street and pulled open his truck door. Bolt, who had been dozing, sat up. He looked at Jack, and his tail gave one hopeful thump. Then the dog seemed to sense the change in him, the rigid set of his jaw, the focused cold light in his eyes. Bolt's tail stopped wagging. He just watched his man, alert. Jack started the engine. The drive back to the ranch was a blur of brown hills and endless sky. He wasn't just a man driving home anymore. He was a soldier with a mission. This wasn't just a broken house. It was a riddle. It was an injustice. He pulled up to the ranch just as the sun was beginning to touch the mountains. The house looked dark, foreboding, its empty windows like accusations. Bolt woke up. He stretched, looked at the house, and immediately began to whine. It was the low, anxious sound, his body tensing, his gaze fixed on the kitchen window. Jack got out of the truck. He stood there for a long moment, the wind tearing at his shirt. The town thought a crime had happened here. They thought a mother had murdered her child. His dog, his partner, his infallible watchman, was terrified of that kitchen. Jack's jaw set. Bolt wasn't afraid of a ghost. He was afraid of a secret. "They think she did it, Bolt," Jack said, his voice quiet but carrying in the wind. "They think she hurt that baby." Bolt whined in response, his eyes locked on the house. "They're wrong," Jack said. He slammed the truck door shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast quiet. "And we're going to find out why." Jack didn't unload the supplies. He left the bags of nails and cans of stew in the truck bed, the evening chill already creeping over them. He stood by the driver's side door, the Wyoming wind pulling at his flannel shirt, and stared at the house. It was no longer just a project. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a riddle, an accusation. The sun had sunk behind the Laramie Mountains, leaving the sky a bruised, deep purple. The house looked black against it, its empty windows like vacant eye sockets. The wind whistled through the gaps in the siding, a low, mournful sound that now seemed to carry the weight of Evelyn Dean's story. Vanished? A clumsy lie. A crime. In the truck cab, Bolt whined. It was a high-pitched, anxious sound. He hadn't moved from the passenger seat. "Come on, boy," Jack said, his voice flat. He opened the passenger door. Bolt looked at him, then at the house, and whined again. He put his head down, his ears flat. "Bolt, come. Feel." Jack's voice was quiet, but it was an order. Reluctantly, the big shepherd hopped down from the truck. But he didn't run to the porch. He stayed by Jack's side, his body pressed against the man's leg, his gaze fixed on the dark, silent house. "They're wrong," Jack muttered again, more to himself than the dog. He was clinging to that belief. The alternative, that the woman in the photograph had done the unthinkable, was a darkness he refused to let in. His own ghosts were enough. He felt a kinship with the accused, with the person judged, not right in the head, by a town that knew nothing. He walked to the porch, his boots heavy on the old wood. Bolt followed, but only as far as the top step. When Jack pushed open the front door and stepped into the gloom of the main room, Bolt stayed outside, a silver-gray statue in the fading light. Jack flipped the switch on his battery-powered lantern, and a cold, white light flooded the room, casting huge, distorted shadows. He walked through the short hallway, his footsteps echoing. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen. Bolt was still on the porch, but he was now standing, his head raised, whining. The sound was desperate, a clear warning. "Don't go in there." Jack looked into the kitchen. It was pitch black. This was the one room he had avoided, the one room Bolt had forbidden. He could already smell it from the hallway, the faint cold odor of mold and damp earth. His old theory, the one he'd held on to for the past few days, felt laughably thin. This was not a dead raccoon. A dead animal would have rotted and faded. This smell was ancient, permanent, and Bolt's fear was not just disgust. It was a deep instinctual terror. The rumors from town, Bolt's persistent fear. The two streams had merged, and they both flowed directly to the center of this room. "I have to know, boy," Jack whispered. He was a man trained for confrontation. He was a ranger. You didn't ignore a threat. You didn't cower from the unknown. You geared up, you faced it, and you dealt with it. He turned and walked back to his cot. He pulled his old army footlocker out from under it. He opened the lid and took out a heavy, black metal flashlight, a long 3-cell maglite. He clicked it on. The beam was powerful, cutting a sharp white circle on the far wall. He went back outside to the truck. Bolt met him, whining as if begging him to reconsider. "Stay," Jack commanded. From the truck's toolbox, he retrieved his longest, heaviest crowbar. It was 3 feet of solid steel. He felt the familiar, reassuring weight in his hand. He put a pair of thick leather work gloves on, pulling them tight at the wrists. He was ready. He walked back into the house, his boots making decisive, heavy sounds on the floor. He didn't pause in the main room. He walked straight into the dark kitchen, the beam of his flashlight preceding him. Behind him, in the hallway, Bolt's whining escalated into a high-pitched, frantic keen. "Easy, boy," Jack said, his jaw tight. "Stay." He was in the center of the room now. He shined the light down. The floor was covered in peeling, cracked linoleum, a faded yellow flower pattern from a forgotten decade. And in the very center, just as he remembered, was the trapdoor. It was a perfect square of the original floorboards, outlined by a dark crack. In its center was a recessed, U-shaped ring of dark, rusted metal. Jack planted his feet. He shined the light on Bolt, who was crouched in the hallway, trembling, his eyes wide and reflecting the light. He absolutely refused to set one paw on the kitchen floor. "It's just a floor, Jack," he told himself. But he knew it was a lie. This was the nexus. This was what the town feared. This was what his dog feared. He put the flashlight on the floor, angling the beam to illuminate the trapdoor. He took a deep breath, the cold, musty air filling his lungs. He bent down and gripped the metal ring with his gloved hand. It was ice cold. He pulled. Nothing. The ring didn't budge. He braced his feet and heaved, his back and shoulder muscles straining. The ring was solid. The door was sealed shut, fused to the floor by 50 years of damp, rot, and neglect. "Fine," he grunted. He picked up the crowbar. He jammed the sharp, flat end into the thin crack beside the ring. He put his full weight on the bar. A high-pitched metallic shriek echoed through the house as the steel bit into the wood. The floor groaned in protest. Bolt let out a single, sharp bark of panic. "It's all right," Jack said, gritting his teeth. He repositioned the bar, getting a deeper purchase. "I have to know." He threw his entire body weight onto the crowbar. There was a sound like a pistol shot, a sharp, sudden crack as the wood splintered, and the rusted hinges on the far side gave way. The entire door shuddered and jumped, breaking free from the floor. Jack dropped the crowbar. He got his gloved fingers into the gap he'd created. He braced himself and lifted. The door was impossibly heavy, waterlogged and dense. He strained, his muscles burning, and slowly heaved the heavy square of wood up, over, and let it fall back against the kitchen floor. It landed with a heavy, solid thud that seemed to shake the entire house. Instantly, a blast of air rushed up from the hole. It was not a breeze, it was an exhalation, a cold, wet breath from deep in the earth. It hit Jack in the face, staggering him. And the smell. It was overwhelming. It was the odor of a place that had never seen light. It was the concentrated, suffocating smell of cold, packed earth, of a million years of damp, of deep, profound mildew, and of something else, something dark and mineral. It was the smell of a cave, of a tomb. Jack coughed, his eyes watering. He grabbed the flashlight. He looked back at Bolt. The dog was no longer whining. He was silent, low to the ground, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. Jack turned back. He aimed the powerful beam of the flashlight down into the gaping black square in his kitchen floor. He saw nothing, just a perfect, absorbing darkness. The light seemed to fall into it and die. He angled the beam and caught the edge of something. Wet, rotting wooden steps, descending into the black. Jack stood at the precipice, the cold, wet air from the cellar washing over him. It was a physical presence, a tangible wave of decay and ancient stillness. The beam of his maglite cut into the darkness, but the blackness seemed to drink the light, revealing only the first few steps of a rotting wooden staircase. From the hallway behind him, Bolt let out a short, anxious bark. It was a sound of profound distress, a desperate plea for his man to come back, to close the door and leave this place alone. Jack held his breath. His every instinct, the ones honed in the deserts of Afghanistan and the alleys of Baghdad, screamed at him to retreat, to secure the door and contain the threat. This was a bad place. This was an ambush. But the anger he'd felt in town, the hot, righteous fury at the injustice done to Amelia Croft, was stronger than his fear. He had to know. He couldn't live in this house, haunted by both his own ghosts and the town's, without knowing the truth. "I'm all right, boy," he said, his voice a low growl. It was meant to reassure the dog, but it was mostly for himself. He gripped the flashlight and the heavy steel crowbar in his left hand, leaving his right hand free to brace against the wall. He tested the first step with his boot. The wood was slick with damp, but it seemed to hold. He took another step, descending into the cold. The air grew heavier with each step, the smell of packed earth and mildew becoming so thick he could taste it. It was cold, but not the clean, sharp cold of the Wyoming night. It was a deep, subterranean cold, a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Bolt was barking steadily now, a rhythmic, frantic sound that echoed horribly in the small kitchen space above. It was the sound of a dog watching its owner walk into danger. Jack reached the bottom. His boots made a soft, sucking sound as they met the floor. It wasn't wood or concrete. It was cold, packed clay. He was in. The cellar was pitch black. He was standing in a box of absolute darkness, the only sound his own breathing and the frantic barking of his dog, which sounded strangely muffled, as if the thick, dead air of the cellar was swallowing the noise. He raised the maglite. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the walls. They were made of dark, wet fieldstone, expertly stacked, the gaps filled with old, crumbling mortar. The low ceiling was made of massive, hand-hewn wooden beams, slick with condensation. He swept the light around the room. It was small, perhaps 15 feet by 15 feet. Just as he'd expected, it was mostly empty, a tomb of forgotten chores. Along the far wall, a set of high canning shelves stood, their wood warped and bowed, draped in thick gray cobwebs. On the floor beneath them, he saw the glint of broken glass, a dozen or more old mason jars shattered. Near the stairs, a collection of rusted metal sat in a pile, the head of a shovel, a broken pitchfork, and a roll of wire. It was just a cellar, a 50-year-old flooded, rotten cellar. The smell was horrific, but it was the logical smell of this place. The dead animal, the mold. This was the source. Jack let out a long breath. He felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a pang of foolishness. He had let the town's ghost stories and his dog's anxiety get to him. He was a ranger, standing in a dark room, spooked by shadows. "It's just a cellar, Bolt," he called out, his voice sounding flat and dead in the heavy air. "It's all right. Just rotten." He turned, aiming his light at the stairs, ready to climb back up into the clean, cold night air. But Bolt's barking changed. It was no longer the frantic, anxious sound of fear. It stopped, and for a second, there was silence. Then it started again, but different. It was a deep, steady, focused bark. It was not a sound of panic. It was an alert. It was the sound a trained canine makes when it is on a scent, a command to its handler. Pay attention. It is here. Jack froze. He was a soldier. He knew that sound. That was not a bark of fear. That was a bark of discovery. He stood at the base of the steps, his back to the room. Bolt was at the top of the stairs, barking down into the darkness, but not at him. The dog was barking at the room behind him. Slowly, Jack turned back around. He raised the flashlight again. "What is it, boy? What do you see?" He swept the beam across the room, past the shelves, past the broken glass. His gaze followed the invisible line of Bolt's insistent barking. He aimed the light at the farthest, darkest corner, and he saw it. The fieldstone walls were neat, set in mortar. But here, in this one corner, it was different. It was a pile of loose stones. It wasn't a collapse. The wall behind it was intact. This was a separate, intentional mound, about 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, jutting out from the foundation. The stones were the same as the walls, dark, flat, heavy, but they were unmortared. They were just stacked, one on top of the other, in a crude, solid pile. It looked exactly like a cairn. A cold dread, far deeper than the cellar's chill, washed over him. Why would anyone do this? Why would you pile heavy stones inside a cellar, unless it wasn't a pile, unless it was a covering? As if to cover something, he whispered. Evelyn's words echoed in his head. They searched the hills, the ravines. Nothing. Not a trace. Bolt's barking became frantic again, a high-pitched, desperate warning. Get away from it? Jack's heart was a heavy, dull thud in his chest. He took a step toward the corner. The air here felt thicker, the smell of damp earth more potent. He could see the pile clearly now. It was built with purpose. The largest, flattest stones were at the bottom, smaller ones filling the gaps. It was meant to be heavy. It was meant to be permanent. He was shaking, but not from the cold. He was shaking with a terrible, consuming dread. He wanted to run up the stairs, slam the door shut, get in his truck with his dog, and drive until the Wyoming sky was just a memory. But he thought of Amelia. He thought of the town calling her a monster. He thought of his own anger, his need to prove them wrong. What if this proved them right? He had to know. Steady, he breathed, the word a cloud of white vapor in the beam of his light. He set the mag light down on an empty shelf, angling the beam to illuminate the dark corner. He gripped the heavy crowbar with both gloved hands. Bolt was losing his mind at the top of the stairs, a constant shrieking series of barks. "I'm here, boy," Jack said, gritting his teeth. "I'm right here." He wedged the flat end of the crowbar into a gap between two of the largest stones at the top of the pile. He put his boot against the wall for leverage and pulled back with all his strength. The stones scraped, a loud, grating protest that set Jack's teeth on edge. It didn't want to move. He pulled again, his muscles straining. The stone shifted and then fell, landing on the soft clay floor with a dull, heavy, sickening thud. The air was filled with the smell of displaced earth. He was breathing hard now, his heart hammering against his ribs. He repositioned the crowbar, attacking the next stone. It was wedged in tight. He had to fight for it, jamming the bar in, pulling, shifting. Another scrape, and the second stone fell. He was dismantling it. He was uncovering the 50-year-old secret of the Croft Ranch. And with every stone he moved, the sick feeling of dread in his stomach grew, a cold certainty that he was about to find something that could never be buried again. The last stone scraped away, landing on the soft clay floor with a dull, heavy thud. Jack was breathing in ragged gasps, his shoulders burning. The pile was gone. He was staring at the wall. The fieldstone foundation was intact, just as he'd thought. But where the pile had been, there was now a void, a hole. Someone had intentionally removed the stones from the foundation to create a small, dark nook, a cavity about 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep. At the top of the stairs, Bolt's barking was a continuous, frantic shriek, an alarm that hammered at Jack's already frayed nerves. He knelt, his knees sinking slightly into the damp clay. He aimed the powerful beam of his flashlight into the hole. Something was in there. It was not a body. It was too small. A wave of profound, cold relief washed over him, so strong it almost made him dizzy. The town was wrong. The darkest, most terrible possibility was not true. But something was hidden here. He reached his gloved hand into the dark, cold space. His fingers brushed against something stiff, waxy, and cold. It was a package. He gripped it. It was heavier than he expected, dense and solid. He pulled it out, dragging it over the stones. It was a bundle, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in a thick, dark material. It looked like an old, oiled canvas tarp, an oilcloth, the kind sailors or ranchers would use to waterproof their gear. It was tied securely with what looked like heavy twine. The dread he'd felt, the sick fear of finding human remains, evaporated. It was replaced by an intense, laser-focused curiosity. This was the secret. This was the answer. This was what Amelia Croft had hidden from the world. He looked up at the top of the stairs, where Bolt's frantic barking continued, a desperate, pulsing rhythm in the night. "I have it, Bolt," Jack said, his voice a low grunt. "I'm coming up." He tucked the heavy package under one arm. He grabbed his crowbar in the same hand and gripped the flashlight with the other. He backed away from the corner, his gaze sweeping the small, dark room one last time. It was just a cellar again. But now he knew its secret. He climbed the slick, rotting steps, his boots heavy with clay. He emerged from the black hole into the dimly lit kitchen. He stepped onto the peeling linoleum, his breath clouding in the cold air of the house. He was back on solid ground. The instant his boots hit the kitchen floor, the barking stopped. The sudden absolute silence was shocking. It was heavier and more profound than any of the quiet he had experienced on the ranch. The kitchen, which had been ringing with frantic echoing barks, was now deathly still. Jack stood there, breathing hard, the heavy package clutched to his side. He heard a sound from the hallway. It was the faint click of claws on the hardwood floor. He turned. Bolt was there, in the doorway, no longer cowering. His body was still tense, his ears pinned back, but he was slowly, cautiously inching his way onto the kitchen floor. This was the first time he had voluntarily entered the room. The dog's gaze was fixed, not on the open cellar door, but on the oilcloth package under Jack's arm. Jack slowly knelt and placed the package on the floor in the center of the room. He set the crowbar down beside it with a soft clank. Bolt crept forward. He was low to the ground, his body language still showing deep anxiety, but his terror was gone. It had been replaced by an overwhelming, cautious curiosity. He stopped a foot away from the package. He lowered his head, his black nose twitching, sniffing the air around the bundle. He did not touch it. He then moved, with that same cautious, low-to-the-ground crawl, to the open cellar door. He sniffed the air rising from the blackness. He whined, a low, soft sound, and backed away. He looked at the hole. He looked at the package. He looked at Jack. His assessment seemed complete. The threat, the danger, the wrongness that he had sensed was still connected to that hole, but the focus of it was now in this package. His man had it. The immediate danger had been contained. Bolt backed up a few feet, clear of the cellar door, and sat down. His entire body was rigid. He was watching Jack with an intensity that was almost human. His amber eyes were locked on his man. He was waiting. "Okay, boy," Jack whispered, his voice shaky. "Let's see what they were so afraid of." He didn't want to do this in the dark. He retrieved his lantern from the main room and set it on the kitchen counter, clicking it on. A bright, stable, white light flooded the room, illuminating the peeling wallpaper, the open cellar, and the small, dark package on the floor. Jack sat cross-legged on the cold linoleum, his back to the cabinets. He pulled the package in front of him. Bolt stayed in his spot, a silver-gray sentinel, watching. Jack's gloved fingers fumbled with the twine. It was old and stiff with mildew. He gave up on the knot and pulled hard. The fibers, rotten with 50 years of damp, gave way with a faint, brittle snap. He began to unfold the oilcloth. It was stiff, like old leather, and cracked at the creases. It was covered in a film of grime and mold, but it had done its job. The inside was remarkably dry. As he peeled back the final layer of canvas, he saw what was inside. There were 2 items. The first was a book. It was a simple, leather-bound journal about the size of his hand. The dark leather cover was warped and stiff, and a constellation of white mildew spots covered it like a disease. The second was a metal tin. It was an old biscuit tin, its lid painted with a faded design of pink and yellow flowers, now almost completely obscured by rust and tarnish. His heart was hammering. He reached for the tin first. It was light. He worked his fingers under the lid, trying to pry it open. It was rusted shut. He grabbed the crowbar, used the flat edge to gain leverage, and gave a sharp twist. A high-pitched, metallic shriek cut through the silence as the lid bent and popped open. Jack put the crowbar down. He pulled the lid off. The smell of old, dry wool and lavender drifted up. He looked inside. There were 3 items nestled on a bed of what looked like dried flowers. First, he saw a tiny hand-knitted bootie. It was made of soft wool, the color of pale butter. It was impossibly small. Second, beside the bootie, was a lock of hair. It was fine, almost like spun silk, and a pale golden blonde color. It was tied with a tiny, faded blue ribbon. Jack's hands, which had been steady as he moved the stones, began to shake. He looked at the third item. It was a silver locket, heart-shaped, no bigger than his thumbnail. It was black with tarnish. He picked it up, the metal cold against his glove. He fumbled with the clasp. It opened. Even in the dim light, he could see it. It was a photograph, tiny and faded, of a baby swaddled in a white blanket, its eyes closed as if in sleep. These were not the hidden items of a monster. They were not the tools of a crime. They were treasures. They were the relics of a mother's profound love. He gently placed the locket back in the tin. His gaze fell on the second item in the oilcloth bundle, the moldy leather-bound journal. This was the explanation. This was the voice. He picked it up. His hands were trembling so much he could barely hold it. He sat there on the cold kitchen floor, the open cellar breathing its cold air at his back, and his dog watching him in the silent, waiting house. He opened the cover. Jack sat on the cold linoleum floor of the kitchen, the open cellar at his back, breathing a constant cold sigh of damp earth. The bright, sterile beam of the lantern on the counter cast a harsh light on the two objects in front of him: the open biscuit tin with its tiny, heartbreaking treasures, and the moldy, leather-bound journal. Bolt, who had kept his vigil, seemed to sense a change in the atmosphere. The immediate, high-strung tension had eased, replaced by a deep, somber quiet. He moved from his seated position, his claws clicking softly, and lay down beside Jack, his body pressed against the man's thigh. He rested his heavy gray head on Jack's knee, letting out a long, low sigh, his amber eyes still fixed on the objects. Jack's gloved fingers fumbled as he opened the journal. The cover was stiff, the leather warped. The first page was stuck to the inside cover, and he had to work it free, the sound of tearing, dry paper unnaturally loud in the silence. The first entry was dated July 1972. The handwriting was beautiful. It was a flowing, feminine script, full of loops and flourishes, written in deep blue ink. It was the handwriting of a person full of life and hope. Jack began to read. The first pages were exactly what the summary had promised: a chronicle of love. Amelia Croft wrote about her life on the ranch, the color of the sky, her love for her husband, Mark. She wrote about the harsh, beautiful landscape of Wyoming, the wind that she called the world's oldest song. Then, in an entry dated November 1972, the tone became electric. Rose. We will call her Rose. Jack found himself reading about the birth of her daughter. He read about her first cry, her weight, 7 pounds, 3 ounces, the shock of her pale, golden hair, just like her father's. He read about the exhaustion and the overwhelming, terrifying love. He read about sleepless nights, about the funny, gurgling sound Rose made when she slept, about the way her tiny hand would grip his finger so tightly he felt his heart would break. Jack paused, his throat tight. He looked at the tiny knitted booty in the tin. This was the woman the town had turned into a monster. This was the mother they accused of an unthinkable crime. The anger he'd felt in the library returned, cold and hard. He was a man who knew grief, who knew the darkness that lived in the human heart. But this was not the journal of a killer. This was a testament. He kept reading, turning the brittle, water-stained pages. The entries for winter were sparse, filled with the simple, repetitive joy of a new mother. Then, in February 1973, the tone shattered. Mark is gone. There was only that one line. The next 10 pages were blank. When the entries resumed in March 1973, the handwriting was different. It was still neat, but the loops were gone. It was tighter, more brittle, as if the writer was holding herself together by sheer force of will. She wrote of the crushing silence. She wrote of her loneliness, but mostly she wrote of Rose. She is all I have. She is my light. As long as I have her, I can bear this. She smiled today. A real smile. I know she did. Jack's own hands, resting on the book, were clenched. He felt a profound, aching connection to this woman. He understood this. He knew what it was to lose your anchor, to lose your brother in arms, and to be left with only a single, desperate reason to keep breathing. Then he turned the page, and the date read, April 12th, 1973. The tragedy had begun. It's snowing again, the entry read. I cannot believe it. It is mid-April, but the wind is a scream. The sky is white. I am so tired of the cold. April 13th, 1973. The snow is over the windows. I have never seen a storm like this. It is a white wall. The radio is just static. Rose has a cough, a small, dry sound that frightens me. April 14th, 1973. The power is gone. The house is so cold. I have brought Rose's cradle into the kitchen. It is the only room I can keep warm with the wood stove. I tried the phone. It is dead, just a hollow, empty sound. I am cut off. Rose is burning. Her skin is so hot. Her cough is worse. It sounds wet. Please, please, let this storm break. Jack stopped. He could hear the wind howling outside the house now, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the past. He was in the very room where she had written this. He was sitting on the floor where her child's cradle had been. Bolt whined, a low, sympathetic sound, as if sensing Jack's distress. He nudged his cold nose into Jack's hand. Jack absently stroked the dog's head, his eyes scanning the next page. The handwriting was becoming frantic. April 15th, 1973. She will not eat. She is too weak. I am melting snow for water, trying to force a few drops into her. The fever will not break. I have no one. I am screaming for help, but the wind just swallows the sound. I am so afraid. She is all I have. April 16th, 1973. She is fighting, but her breathing, it is so shallow, a terrible rattling sound. I have been praying. I have been begging. The storm will not stop. There is no world outside this house. Only white, only the cold, and the wind, and the sound of her breathing. Jack felt his own chest tighten. He felt the familiar cold panic of complete and utter helplessness. The feeling he'd had in the dust, watching Evans bleed out, knowing there was nothing he could do. He was sharing this woman's trauma, 50 years too late. Then he turned to the final page. It was barely a page at all. It was just a few lines in the middle, the handwriting so violently scrawled, the pen must have torn the paper. The ink was blurred, the spots where tears had fallen, and made the blue ink run like a watercolor. She is gone. The words were almost illegible. My light, my Rose. She passed away this morning. She is so cold. The fever is gone, and she is so, so cold. I held her. I wrapped her in my best blanket. I tried to go outside. I tried to take her to the hill to bury her, but the snow, it is a monster. The ground is iron. I cannot leave her in the snow. Jack had to stop. He closed his eyes. The pain in the words was physical. He took a ragged breath and read the last terrible lines. I know what to do. A bed, a warm bed, safe from the storm. I made her a warm bed in the cellar, in the wall. It is safe there. It is quiet. I will put her treasures there with her to keep her company. Jack's gaze flew to the open biscuit tin, the booty, the lock of hair. He read the final heartbreaking sentence. It is a good, safe place. I will wait for Thomas to come. Thomas will know what to do. I will wait for Thomas to come. The rest of the journal was empty. Jack slowly closed the book. The silence of the kitchen was deafening. He looked at the open black square of the cellar, breathing its cold, earthy air. He looked at the pile of stones he had dismantled, a warm bed in the cellar. He finally understood. He understood everything. The nook was not a hiding place for a criminal. It was a temporary grave. It was a mother's last, desperate act of love in a world that had frozen. She couldn't bury her child in the snow, so she had made her a tomb, a sanctuary, in the only place the storm couldn't touch. And Bolt. Jack turned his head and looked at his dog. The big shepherd was watching him, his amber eyes full of a wisdom that shook Jack to his core. The dog's fear, the whining, the refusal to enter the room, the frantic barking as Jack descended the stairs, the focused alert at the corner. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't mold or a dead raccoon. It was the smell. 50 years of damp and cold had not been able to erase it. It was the faint, mineral, unmistakable smell of death. Jack's dog, his partner, had sensed the profound, lingering sorrow of that cellar. He had been reacting to a mother's grief, to the resting place of a child. Jack reached out and buried his hand in the thick gray fur of Bolt's neck. He pulled the dog close, pressing his forehead against the animal's. "You knew," Jack whispered, his voice thick. "You knew all along." Jack spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, sitting on the cold floor, the journal clutched in his hands. Bolt never left his side, a warm, silent presence, his head resting on Jack's knee. The wind howled outside, a constant, mournful sound, but Jack no longer heard it. He heard Amelia's voice, desperate and broken, crying out for Thomas. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the unboarded windows, Jack finally stirred. His body ached, but his mind was clear, focused with a grim resolve. The town was wrong. Horribly, tragically wrong. Amelia Croft was not a monster. She was a victim, twice over, first of the blizzard, then of the town's cruel judgment. And now Jack knew he had a new mission. He carefully placed the journal and the biscuit tin back into the oilcloth package. He would not rebury it. Not yet. He needed to find Thomas Croft. Using his phone, Jack searched the county records. It was surprisingly easy. Thomas Croft, the record stated, born 1930. That would make him 93. Current residence, Laramie Creek County Nursing Home. Jack packed the oilcloth package securely in his duffel bag. He put Bolt in the truck, telling him to stay. The dog whined, sensing the gravity of the trip, but obeyed. Jack then drove back into Laramie Creek, the small town that held so much judgment and so little truth. The nursing home was a modern red brick building on the edge of town, a stark contrast to the dilapidated ranch. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and old age. Jack approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Thomas Croft." The young nurse at the desk, a woman in her 20s, looked up, surprised. "Mr. Croft? He doesn't get visitors?" Her eyes flicked to Jack's weathered face, his military bearing. "Are you family?" "A distant relative," Jack lied smoothly, a skill honed by years of covert operations. "Just found out he was here. I'm Jack Callahan." The nurse looked skeptical, but eventually she pointed him down a long corridor. "Room 207, but he's not very talkative. Sometimes confused." Jack walked down the carpeted hallway, the air thick with the muffled sounds of television sets and distant conversations. He found room 207. The door was ajar. He pushed it open gently. The room was small, sparse, and smelled faintly of menthol. An old man sat in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. He was frail, his skin thin and papery, his white hair a wispy halo around a bald spot. His hands, gnarled with age, rested on his lap. He was wearing a faded plaid shirt and dark trousers. This was Thomas Croft, the man who had woven the disastrous lie. "Mr. Croft," Jack said, stepping inside. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head. He just continued to stare out the window. "My name is Jack Callahan," Jack said, his voice quiet. He walked closer. "I bought the old Croft Ranch on Wind River Road." At the mention of the ranch, Thomas's head slowly, stiffly turned. His eyes, faded blue and rheumy with age, squinted at Jack. They held a spark of suspicion and something else. A deep, profound weariness. "That old place," Thomas rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Why'd you do that?" "I found something there, Mr. Croft," Jack said. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out the oilcloth package. He carefully unwrapped it, first revealing the biscuit tin, then the journal. He placed them on the small bedside table, pushing aside a half-eaten bowl of pudding. Thomas's eyes widened. He stared at the moldy leather-bound journal, then at the rusted biscuit tin with its faded flowers. His hands, which had been still, began to tremble. Where did you get those?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "In the cellar," Jack said, "in a secret nook, behind some stacked stones." The color drained from Thomas Croft's face. He looked at the journal, then at Jack, a terrible, dawning realization in his faded eyes. His breath hitched. His old body seemed to shrink in the wheelchair. She kept it there, he breathed, a ghost of a sound. Jack pushed the tin closer. He opened the lid, revealing the tiny wool booty, the lock of golden hair, and the tarnished silver locket with the baby's faded photograph. Thomas stared at them. A tear, thick and slow, welled in his eye and tracked a path down his wrinkled cheek. He reached out a trembling hand, his gnarled finger gently touching the tiny booty. Then his entire frame seemed to buckle. He let out a low, choking sob, a sound of profound, ancient grief. The tears came freely now, silent rivers down his withered face. "Oh, Amelia," he whispered over and over. "Amelia, my poor Amelia." Jack said nothing. He just waited. He had seen strong men break. He had heard the sounds of their breaking. This was the sound of a man breaking from a burden carried for half a century. "I tried to protect her," Thomas finally choked out, his voice hoarse. "I swear, I didn't know what to do." He looked at Jack, his eyes pleading for understanding. Jack sat in the chair next to the window, letting the old man speak. "The storm," Thomas began, his voice gaining strength as the confession poured out. This was tier 1 of his burden, arriving late. "It was so bad, I couldn't get through for days. When I finally reached the ranch, it was quiet. Too quiet." He paused, a shudder going through him. "I found her in the kitchen. She was just sitting there, staring, rocking herself. She kept saying, 'I killed her, Thomas. I killed her. I couldn't keep her warm. The cold took her. She was catatonic. She was broken.'" Thomas wiped his face with a trembling hand. "And then I saw it, the cellar, and I knew. I saw the loose stones. I knew Rose was down there." He squeezed his eyes shut. "I panicked. I was so scared for Amelia. The town. They already thought she was not right after Mark died. If they found Rose, if they heard Amelia's words, they would have taken her. They would have locked her away. Or worse, accused her of the unspeakable." This was tier 2 of his burden, the lie. "So I took her, I bundled her into my truck. I drove her all the way to Colorado, to a facility there. I told them she was my sister, that she'd suffered a terrible breakdown." He looked at Jack, his gaze desperate. "And then I came back. I knew I couldn't tell the truth. It was too ugly. So I told that stupid lie, that she'd left, that she'd caught a bus back east. It was the only thing I could think of to protect her, to make them forget." He shook his head, a deep, bitter regret etched on his face. "But they never forgot. They just turned it into something worse. They twisted it. They called her a murderer, and me, her accomplice." Jack nodded, his own anger at the town rekindled. They didn't understand. They couldn't. Thomas closed his eyes again. The third tier of his burden, the heaviest, was yet to come. "I visited her," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "For the first few years, she was never really there. She lived in her own world. Sometimes she'd call me Mark. Sometimes she'd just stare at the wall. She never knew where she was." He opened his eyes, and they were full of a terrible, profound sorrow. "She died there, at that facility, almost 20 years ago, in 1999. Jack felt a sharp pang in his chest. Amelia had died in exile, far from her home, far from her child. "And I never brought her back," Thomas said, his voice cracking. This was tier 3 of his burden, the final tragedy. "That's the worst of it, the worst sin. I couldn't. How could I? If I brought her body back, if I gave her a proper burial here, it would have exposed everything. The lie, the cellar, Yash, the secret grave, the shame." He leaned forward, his frail body trembling. "So I left her there, buried in a stranger's cemetery, alone, far away from Rose. That's my greatest guilt, Mr. Callahan, that she's not with her baby, that I couldn't give her that." He was crying openly now, deep, silent sobs that racked his old frame. Jack reached out, his hand covering Thomas's gnarled, trembling hand. He felt the cold touch of 50 years of unspoken pain. Jack looked at the small, tarnished locket, at the faded photograph of the sleeping baby. He looked at the moldy journal, at the words of a mother's unbreakable love. He looked at the old broken man in front of him, tormented by a single, desperate, well-intentioned lie. He knew this man's pain. He knew the crushing weight of guilt, the paralyzing fear of judgment, the horror of being unable to save someone you loved. He understood the desperate choices made in impossible situations. And in that moment, in that quiet room, Jack Callahan, the ranger haunted by his own failures, felt a profound, unexpected connection to Thomas Croft. They were two men separated by generations and circumstances, both carrying the unbearable burden of a past they couldn't change. Thomas Croft sat in his wheelchair, his frail body racked by the deep, shuddering sobs of a grief 50 years contained. The confession, a three-tiered burden of crushing weight, had finally been spoken. He was exposed, broken, a man at the end of his life, admitting his greatest failures to a stranger. Jack Callahan looked at the old man. He did not see a liar. He did not see a coward or the accomplice the town had painted him to be. He saw himself. He saw the same torment that lived in his own chest. He saw a man who had been put in an impossible, unwinnable situation, who had been forced to make a decision in the midst of trauma, chaos, and blinding grief. Thomas, faced with a blizzard and a dead child, had lied to protect Amelia. Jack, faced with an ambush and a dying friend, had followed an order that he would forever believe was the wrong one. Both were haunted by the same ghost, the ghost of what if. What if Thomas had told the truth? What if Jack had defied the order? They were both survivors, trapped in the amber of a single, catastrophic moment, forced to live with the consequences of a decision that could never be undone. Jack's anger at the town, his fury at the injustice, all of it softened into a deep, profound empathy. He reached out and placed his hand on Thomas's thin, trembling shoulder. The bones felt as brittle as a bird's wing. "Thomas," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the old man's sobs. "You were in an unwinnable situation." Thomas flinched, his sobs catching in his throat. He slowly looked up, his eyes blurred with tears, expecting judgment, condemnation, the final deserved nail in his coffin. "You were trying to save her," Jack continued, his gaze unwavering. "You were alone, and you were scared, and you were grieving too. You made the only decision you thought you could to protect her. It was the wrong one, maybe, but it was made from love." Jack's own voice was thick. He was speaking to Thomas, but the words were for himself, an absolution he had been unable to grant. "It's time to forgive that." Thomas stared at him, his mouth open, a soundless gasp. He had expected the town's hatred. He had not expected this. He had not expected grace. Jack stood up, his resolve hardening. "We can't change what the town believes," he said, his voice flat. "We're not going to try. It doesn't matter what they think. What matters is this." He motioned to the journal and the tin. "We can't fix the lie, but we can fix the end of the story. We can bring them home." A few days later, Jack pushed Thomas's wheelchair into the small modern office of the Laramie Creek County Sheriff. The sheriff was a man in his 40s with a calm, professional demeanor. He'd heard the rumors, of course, everyone had, but he dealt in facts. Jack laid the oilcloth package on the desk. He didn't speak of ghosts or feelings. He spoke like a soldier giving a report. He presented the journal as evidence, the biscuit tin as corroboration. He explained what he had found and what Thomas had confessed. The sheriff listened, his expression neutral. Then he picked up the journal. He read the first few entries, his brow furrowed. He turned to the last tear-stained pages from April 1973. He read them, his face losing its professional mask, replaced by a deep human sadness. He closed the journal and looked at Thomas, who was watching him, terrified. "Mr. Croft," the sheriff said, his voice gentle. "What you did, obstructing, lying, that was a long time ago. What you didn't do is what matters. This wasn't a crime. This was a tragedy." He promised to handle the legalities. He would file a coroner's report based on the journal, and he would issue the permits to move Rose's remains from the ranch. He would do it quietly and with dignity. A week later, on a cold, bright November morning, a small group gathered in the town cemetery. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Jack was there, Bolt sitting silently at his heel, a solid, warm presence. Thomas was beside him in his wheelchair, wrapped in a thick blanket. Evelyn Dean, the librarian, had come, her face somber, holding a single white rose. The sheriff stood at a respectful distance, his hat in his hand. A local pastor, who had been quietly briefed, stood at the head of a tiny, freshly dug grave. The remains of Rose Croft, recovered from the cellar and placed in a small, dignified wooden box, were lowered into the earth. The pastor spoke simple words of comfort, of a child returned to the earth, of a mother's love. Jack did not watch the grave. He watched Thomas. The old man did not weep. He just watched, his face a mask of profound ancient grief, finally being allowed to see the light of day. He was witnessing the act he had dreaded for 50 years, the one thing he had lied to prevent, and in doing so, he was being set free. Jack looked away, his own throat tight. He thought of Evans. He thought of the dusty, chaotic roadside service, the hurried words spoken under the threat of attack. There had been no peace, no dignity, just guilt. In watching Thomas, Jack saw the unwinnable nature of his own war, the impossible choices that had to be made in a fraction of a second. He saw a man who had carried a burden for 50 years and was now, finally, laying it down. Another week passed. The first real snow of the season had fallen, a light dusting that made the world clean and quiet. Jack drove Thomas to the cemetery one last time. He pushed the wheelchair over the crisp grass, stopping in front of the small plot. A new headstone, simple and made of gray granite, was now in place. Thomas leaned forward, his breathing shaky. Jack stood beside him, Bolt at his side. The engraving was simple. Amelia Croft, 1948, 1999. Rose Croft, 1973, 1973. And beneath their names, the words Jack had suggested, the only words that mattered, reunited in peace. Thomas reached out a trembling, papery hand. He touched the cold stone. His fingers traced Amelia's name, then moved down to trace the name of the daughter she had loved so fiercely. He had done it. After 50 years of guilt, 2 decades after her death in a lonely room in another state, he had finally, symbolically, brought Amelia home. He had put her name next to her child's. He had fixed the end of the story. A long, shuddering sigh left Thomas's body, a sound of absolute, final release. He had laid his burden down. Jack watched him, and as he did, he felt the iron band that had been clenched around his own chest for years, the one labeled Evans, loosen, just a fraction. The guilt was still there. It would always be. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a monster that had him by the throat. It felt like a memory, a scar. He had witnessed an act of true redemption. He had seen a man forgive himself for an unwinnable decision. He put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Bolt, sensing the moment, pushed his heavy gray head under Jack's other hand. They stood there for a long time, the 3 of them in the cold, quiet cemetery under the vast Wyoming sky. The wind had died down. The world, for the first time since Jack had arrived, felt truly, deeply peaceful. A person's greatest tragedy, when buried by silence, can often be mistaken for their greatest sin. But the truth, no matter how deep, patiently waits for a loyal heart to find it. Stories like this remind us that loyalty and compassion can heal the deepest wounds. If you felt that connection today, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe and share this story with others who appreciate the quiet strength of a loyal heart. Your likes and comments truly keep our community going. And we have another journey ready for you. Just click the video that has just appeared on your screen to continue the tales.